I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Last January, as heavily populated parts of Los Angeles burned, images of the disaster brought the destructive power of wildfires into the public consciousness more than ever. Today, as thousands of acres burn in the Pacific Northwest and in Canada, wildfire smoke is causing hazy skies and air quality warnings all the way to the Great Lakes and even Florida. But beyond the danger of flames and pollution, what if there's more in that smoke than we realized? Something alive. Our guest is professor of Wildland Fire Science at the University of Idaho and a pyroaerobiologist. She is working to uncover a surprising and little-known dimension of wildfire, living microbes, bacteria and fungi. These tiny organisms pulled from burning forests and soils are hitching a ride through the air, affecting ecosystems, agriculture, and human health hundreds of miles away. We'll discuss how these microbes survive the intense heat of fires and what it could mean for firefighters, farm workers, and anyone breathing air tainted with wildfire smoke. Dr. Kobziar, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Leda Kobziar. I'm a professor of Wildland Fire Science at the University of Idaho in the College of Natural Resources. My work extends across a wide range of topics that are all related to fire's role on Earth. And in the past, I've focused a lot on fire ecology questions, especially on ecosystems where fire maintains those ecosystems. So these are, the 40% of ecosystems across the world that depend on fire for resulting in the composition and processes that characterize the ecosystems. I've been very interested in the vegetation communities and the soil communities and functioning, things like carbon sequestration and carbon cycling, depending on how often fire occurs in a given location. I've also really focused on the use of prescribed fire and how we can manipulate fire as a tool in order to maintain or send ecosystems in different directions. For example, if for a long time fire has been suppressed in a given location, then we'll see species composition shifts. And in order to kind of reset or restore the system to its original composition, we can use fire as a management tool. So I've been very interested in that line of work for a number of years. And more recently, I've started to explore what really came as a surprising kind of direction for my research. And that was the revelation that there are living things in smoke. And, all along, as a fire ecologist, you don't really look at smoke as an ecological factor very often. There's been very little work done in general on smoke as in terms of its ecological repercussions. And for me, when I recognized that there were actually living things being transported in smoke, it completely changed my research direction and focus and what I'd spend the wee hours of the night thinking about, and what really drives me as a scientist.
What do you mean by living organisms in the smoke?
So there are bacteria and fungi that we have characterized that are actually still living in the smoke. And our research has shown that, at least in the ecosystems that we've addressed so far, that about 70% of what we're finding in smoke is coming from the fuels, the vegetation, the soils that are in the fire zone. So we know that that's where they're coming from. They're coming from the fire environment. They're getting pulled into the fire through convective winds, and then they're being emitted along with smoke. And so they are actually part of the smoke plume and the smoke profile. And we've done a number of different studies now in about 10 places across the country. And in every case, we find that about 70% of what we see is viable. So we use different staining techniques and microscopy and culturing methods, and are able to assess that that a certain percentage of the cells are viable.
What does viable mean? I mean, I read a little bit about how you said there are viable microbes or viable bacteria. Can you explain that more?
When we culture things from smoke, um, we take petri plates and expose them to the smoke, and we can grow organisms directly on those petri plates. We compare those to what's in the air all the time because there's always microorganisms in every air mass. Um, but in the smoke, there's a lot more, and there are different ones. So that's the first way that we can assess viability. So we certainly know that those things are alive. That's, the gold standard. We absolutely are sure. They might be in, for example, a dormant state. And a lot of microorganisms have phases of their lives that are dormant, and it's a protective measure in many cases. So if they're in their dormant state, they might also appear to be viable, but in reality, they're not functioning as if they are interacting with the environment as an awake state of that organism would be.
And you know what these microbes are? I mean, are they kind of typical microbes that you see everywhere, or are they unique to certain locations?
What we generally have found is that it does depend on the location. So, the diversity of the types of systems that are affected by wildland fire is reflected in the smoke composition. So we see a wide diversity of bacteria, a wide diversity of fungi, and that those communities in the smoke are different from what is in background air conditions. So if you're sampling in California versus Florida versus Utah, those communities in the smoke, they're all different from what we find in the background air, but they're also different from each other. So they're just as much a reflection of the diversity of the terrestrial source.
Got it. So, for example, this could be affecting also agriculture, correct? So, in case there is some disease in one part of the country and there's a fire there and the microbes are transferred to another place that could also infect there, right?
Well, there are, like I said, a slew of um, potential animal and human pathogens that are in the smoke. Um, and their effect on human populations is going to be closely related to their concentration. So, these things have environmental reservoirs. That's why, when the environmental reservoir gets uh, affected by a highly disturbing agent like fire, that they get aerosolized and emitted. And usually it's the energy of the fire that creates the winds that are, able to move that smoke high enough so that it's carried long distances. So from their environmental reservoirs, we know that they're traveling, we know that they're being emitted, and their concentrations, once they reach, a human lung, for example, is going to play a major role in whether or not people are affected by them. And so that's something that we are working with modelers on our team to try to understand and make predictions about. Um, we already know a lot about wildfire smoke and how damaging it is to people. What we don't really know is how infectious agents are associated with or not associated with wildfire smoke.
What are the consequences for people? Like, what are the sicknesses that might come out of these very early, I guess, the soil that hasn't been burnt in so long, right? Like, are there things where people getting sick?
There are certain fungal organisms that are of specific interest because we know that they're in soils. We know that they have been increasing in the amount of people who have come down with infections from them. And so we have targeted some certain organisms. So for example, the causative agent of valley fever, coccidioides, an interesting case in the same locations where fire has increased drastically in the last 15 years, those happen to be the same locations that numbers of infections have increased of this soil-borne fungus. Um, so we have focused on that, trying to figure out if we can measure that in the air, if there is any way to capture it, during a fire, during a smoke episode. We haven't found it yet, but we also haven't had the ability to sample in locations where we know it occurs in the soil and they're on fire. So that's coming right around the corner, I'm sure. But that's, why we have the epidemiology approach right now, because there are, like I said, a long list of pathogens that we found. And so now we're going to look at records of smoke occurrence and fungal infections and see if they correlate.
Those type of fungal infections, what are the symptoms?
Depending on the fungal causative agent, it's usually a range of symptoms that involve, something similar to the flu, that you would feel, congestion, you would have a response, um, and, fever, those kinds of things. Oftentimes, people are not immediately diagnosed with the fungal infection. It's just when, other alternative methods of treatment fail and there's still something growing in the lungs, that then they get tested and they can actually find, the fungal colony growing in lung tissue. And then they can be treated for that specifically. So that kind of diagnostic work, I think, is increasing. When people, especially firefighters and agricultural workers, when they report with these symptoms, now they are being screened for valley fever. And that wasn't the case, I think, even just 10 years ago.
So I read that you've coined the term pyroaerobiology. Is that correct?
Yes.
So would you call yourself a pyroaerobiologist?
I would, yes. And I consider it an aspect of fire ecology, but the the really interesting thing for me about it is how, we always talk about things being interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, etc. Um, but this has really, really required a very diverse set of expertise. And so, atmospheric science is a really important component of it. So that includes, meteorology and understanding, global transport models of the chemicals and particulates that are in the air.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Fire Ecology Foundation of the organisms that have, the ability to survive that kind of process. And then the whole world of microbiology too, which was pretty new to me, when I started doing this work. So it's been wonderful at this point in my career to be required to expand my knowledge so much. It's intimidating in some cases, but yeah, I have recognized the importance of convening teams of very interdisciplinary people.
So I recently read a book. It was interesting, but it was a little too much, a little too far-fetched, and it was about somehow these microbes from Russia and from a mining facility in Russia got out and into the rest of the world and were kind of transmitted like pyroaerobiology through those means in a way and invaded other places and people, and it became kind of zombie-ish. So it was interesting. Even, it's kind of, I think, related to what you're working on, right? And in a way, just kind of taken a little bit maybe too far and a little too hoaxy in a way.
It's amazing. There have been definitely some interesting, like, popular media connections. We recently saw a show that I don't even remember what the name is now, but part of the premise was that some kind of mind-altering microorganism was attached to ash and infected people and made them do bizarre things and become zombie-like and etc. Yeah. So I think in terms of maybe the public being primed to imagine the reality of this, gigantic conveyor belt of biodiversity. I think that's there. And I think that's helpful in some ways. But, I also want to emphasize that even though there are, potential pathogens that are being transported, this is a mechanism that has been happening as long as fires have been happening, so that's about 500 million years. So it's not new. It's just that we are understanding it for the first time.
Yeah, it's understanding the ramifications of why even certain things occur. I mean, maybe people will start noticing connections between movements of microbes from one place to another based on fires. That would be.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what we've definitely started to investigate. So it might be that it's revealing more answers for patterns that have existed for a long time, especially with regards to dispersal. Um, and and it's, also I think to emphasize the importance of aerobiology as a field, as a discipline, um, that has kind of gone in and out of interest for a while. And some of that has had to do with the history of, the original work that was done, and how it was, picked up really quickly, of course, um, by military organizations to try to understand what, biological agents could do and their
Right.
transport, et cetera. So then it kind of got taken out of the ecologist sphere. And I think, now it's maybe coming back into more of an ecology mindset, so that when people think about ecology, they recognize that it's not just the fascinating interactions between, terrestrial and aquatic and below ground ecosystems, but you have to consider the ecosystem of the atmosphere as well. Um, and so I think there's a lot of room for us to grow in our impact as aerobiologists with regards to that general recognition of there being, another biome that is generally overlooked because it's kind of hard to see.
Yes, and it seems like there are just continuously new biomes or microbiomes of people realizing the importance of them, right?
Yeah, and it turns out that we're breathing them in all the time. And I do want to also just emphasize the end of that thought, which was that it's not just the pathogens that are there, it's also beneficial organisms, it's nitrogen fixing bacteria, it's mycorrhizae that are critical for plants getting nutrients, especially, coniferous trees. So there are as many, good things in the smoke as there are potentially damaging things. The other thing that's really interesting about how a changing climate might, change the trajectory of this work is that there are new fuels, basically, combustible biomass that was not combustible, just 20 years ago. So that what I'm speaking to specifically are deep organic soils, like permafrost soils, that are thawing deeper and longer because of climate change, which means that those soils are now subject to being burned in wildfires. And if they're burning in wildfires, they're creating smoke. So one of the things I'm really curious about is, are there novel organisms that have been frozen for thousands of years that are now being added to the atmosphere where they haven't been for a long time? Through the process of combustion of those deep organic soils. Those are the types of things, that led to the length of the duration of the Canadian fires, and also a lot of the smoke that was produced was burning of some of these deep organic soils, not in the permafrost region, but in the boreal region, which can extend into permafrost region. They have some overlap. But that part of it is really fascinating to me.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate our conversation today, and it taught me to think differently about fires.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.